Hi, this is Stuart Corrigan from Vanguard in Scotland. In this short video, I'm going to show you how to get the maximum amount of transformation in a service system from the minimum amount of effort and time. You see, what we discovered in Vanguard around about 4 or 5 years ago, that service systems have certain characteristics, and that if you understand essentially where to place the lever, then you can really get an amazing amount of transformation within a service system by not having to work on hundreds and hundreds of different issues. In fact, in most service systems, you can boil it down to knowing that you only have to do 2 or 3 things to really get massive transformation. Now, what we realized about 5 years ago was that service systems have common DNA. In other words, what I mean, if you take the metaphor, the example that I'm using on the screen here, is what you can see is you can see a picture of 2 trees. And I was having a discussion with an academic who was saying to me that, no 2 systems are alike. Look at trees, you will find that there are no 2 trees the same in the world. Now, in one sense, he's right. But what you also realize when you look at organic systems like trees is that they're fractal. Now, what that means is that it means that whilst no 2 trees are the same, certain species of trees have the same characteristics. Now, if you transfer this onto a service system, what you'll see is that actually in service organizations there are only 3 types of system. The first type of system is a transactional type system. In other words, this is like a call center type organization where a customer places a demand on the system and the objective is to deal with that demand there and then, one stop. The customer goes away and another customer comes in. In other words, there's no process that sits behind the transaction. Revenues is another example of this. Benefits could be placed into this kind of system where it's this one-stop transaction. The second kind of environment is a process type environment where the demand that's placed on the system has to go through a certain process. Maybe that 1 or 2 different people are involved in that process, but typically the process is short. The actual value-adding work in the process can be done very, very quickly, and once the demand comes into the system, it will typically come in and it may be done in a day or a few days or an hour and come back out again, and the customer is satisfied. Third type of system is a project type environment. You can also think about a project type environment as a casework type environment where it may go through numerous different people and it may have to stop at certain points for a reason, but the key is that it may take days, even weeks, for something to go through the system. There may be also external constraints. For example, if you look at public sector planning, where the case has to go out to consultation for 21 days, and that's a big limitation in the system. So a project type environment would be public sector planning, for example. It may be IT builds, it may be marketing type systems, road resurfacing type systems, capital works, voids, and a process type environment, which I didn't mention, maybe things like housing repairs, the collection of waste. Another example would be housing allocation system. Another example would be pensions processing, mortgage processing. Elements of banking would be a process system where essentially something can go in, it can be done quickly, and it comes back out the system again. Now, what you'll also see is that there are overlaps, almost like a Venn diagram, where certain systems are made up of transactional and process, or transactional and project, or maybe a little bit of process and a little bit of project. Now what this means is, again, when you understand this, you understand that you have to do something to improve the transactional element and the process element. So in actual fact, if you look at a system like housing repairs, it has a transactional element to it, which is what happens at that very first point of transaction where the customer comes in and makes a request to have the repair done. That's transactional. And then there's a process element where actually someone has to go out and complete the repair. If you look at public sector planning, the same thing. The first point in the system, the customer comes in, they make that request to have the determination complete, and then it becomes a project where actually it goes through various different stages and has to be managed through that system in order to get the determination done for the client. Again, if you were to look at something like road repairs, customer will come in, they will make the demand to say, can I have the pothole repaired, and then it goes through a process. So the key is to know, A, are you managing a transactional system, a process system, or a project environment? And just by knowing this, you then know that actually there are certain levers that I can apply to each of those systems and really get a massive transformation in the performance of the system very, very quickly. So let's just have a look at a transactional system. Now, in a transactional system, the key is one stop. Get the demand in, make sure that you handle that demand well, and the customer is involved in the transaction there and then. They go away and the transaction is done. The other key in a transactional system, of course, is to reduce failure demand, because what you want is you want to only be dealing with value demand in a transactional system. Now let's have a look at revenues. Here's an example of revenues within council tax moves. And here you have an example of the current system. This presentation, incidentally, was a presentation that I did recently to a number of different councils in Lincolnshire based on the work that we've done with 3 councils in the area, which is the City of Lincoln Council, North Kesteven Council and West Lindsey District Council. Now what you can see here is the demand on the system. The value demand is I'm moving in or I'm moving out. As a result, my circumstances have changed, and there's 137 demands per week. There's also some failure demand in the system, which is 41 per week. If you look at the basic flow of the work, what happens is the form is completed by customer services and a note is made on the account. The first problem comes in the sense that they have to complete 6 different forms. Some forms get lost in the system, so you also have to send a memo back to other areas of the system. And customer services also at this point can't give the final balance. So what you see is you have this front office, back office split. It's sent to the back office because of the issues at this front point. 50% of the forms are not clean. At this point, a bill is issued with all the available information. And also, if there is missing information, then a form is sent out to clean the form up. And what you can see in red is that there are 200 to 400 letters sent per month in order to try and clean up the form, 30% of which are not returned. And eventually a new bill is issued when the information is received, which is a massive duplication of effort. It takes up to 12 days to process this with an average of 4, and there's been over 10,000 documents created in the document image processing system. What's interesting is if you were to look at the system and say, what's the value work? Well, the value work is really what happens at that first point, which is doing the work with the customer at the point of transaction. And when you do that, what you see, in other words, when you design against demand, what you see is that actually all the back office work goes away, you get a massive increase in capacity, and from the customer's perspective, service just goes through the roof, because the information that they need is done there and then at the point when they're actually either on the phone or in the office. In other words, the system is, the customer is dealt with by a moves expert. The time to deal with end-to-end with all the information collected becomes almost instant, and what happens is an accurate and complete bill is issued the same day. As a result, everything is processed one stop with no documents at all added to the document image processing system. Better service, lower cost, and a much more interesting job for the staff, because those working at the front of the system now are actually doing fantastic work for the customer, as opposed to what they had to do in the previous system, which was send it back to the back office and do nothing other than spend their time filling out forms. If you think like this, which is design against demand in a transactional system, better service, lower cost, better morale. Now let's look at an example of a system where you have some transactional and some process, which would be a housing repairs system. So again, let's look at some data, what happens at the first point of contact and repairs. You see that 11,000 calls per annum were not answered. Calls offered per annum, in other words, were 81,646 per year. Calls handled were 69,934 with an abandon rate of 11,712, and as a result, as you can imagine, lots of angry tenants. To add insult to injury, 56% of those calls, 41,000 calls per annum, were failure demand. In other words, people calling in to say what's happening, why is it not happening yet, and of the total amount, almost 20,000 calls were not handled one stop, which means the customer is going to be calling back over and over again. Again, this is a transactional piece. Understand the nature of demand, design skills and knowledge against the nature of demand, and as a result, what happens is one stop goes up dramatically, call volume reduces, and again you free up this capacity. And what we found now is that one stop is now up to over 86%, and call volumes have dropped dramatically by taking that action at the first point in the system. When you look at the end-to-end time to actually complete a repair, what you see is that this is a 20-day repair, and in actual fact, the only thing that you could predict about when the next repair will be completed is 77 days or less. This is part of the challenge around what happens when you set a target. In essence, you get this behaviour called student syndrome, which is, although I could do it today, I'll leave it till 15, 16, 17, 18, the 19th day. Also, more time is spent putting repairs into queues than actually doing repairs, and as you can see in this system, a 20-day repair can take up to 77 days to complete. If you look at the process, the CSC, i.e. the Customer Service Centre, makes the appointment. The job is done in the council's time frame, so there's constant pressure to fit jobs into these 10, 15, 20-day jobs. 30% of the descriptions are wrong, and the schedule of rates codes are wrong, which causes problems down the other end of the process at billing as well as in descriptions. With 50% of the repairs, there's no notes in the system at all. As a result, there's wrong materials and work items missed. And in terms of actually the assessment of the job, 20% of the time, because of the poor description, the tradesmen have to go back, get the materials, or they have to stop and rebook the job in. 10% of the time the customer is not in. 5 to 10% of the time other trades haven't completed their bit, so there's delays. 50% of the time there's a wrong phone number. tells them those are rarely available, and if a follow-on call has to be booked, then the repair always gets lost every single time. Now, when you're redesigning a process system, you can use the data in the process to make your redesign. In other words, if you know that what's driving the problems is the fact that the council has set these targets and service standards, if you know that the schedule of rates codes are causing problems, if you know that the descriptions are poor, if you know that the follow-ons are not being booked in, then it allows you to almost laser target those areas and immediately take action. Again, coming back to these points of leverage, that when you can see the problems, you know exactly where to take action. Now again, the key thing to think about in a process environment is this whole concept of value work. So the core concept for leverage in process systems is really about only doing the value work. In other words, looking at the process and asking the question, which elements of this process actually add value to the customer? And also looking at the areas of wasteful activity where things are going on, there's duplications and errors, removing those as well, so that the value work is also done incredibly well. In other words, there's no good having a value adding step, which is turn up to the customer's home to do the repair, if you find that there's been a poor diagnosis. So the value work also has to be done. If you look at the results, we've got first time fix up to 85%. The costs are down by £5 per repair, and the number of repairs per person has increased by 25%. So productivity up, service levels up, costs are down, and again, when you speak to the guys that are doing the repairs, they're saying it's absolutely fantastic because they're getting back to doing the things that they really wanted to do, which is to be, a good joiner, a good plumber, a good tradesman, and actually do a great repair for the customer. What's also interesting is the other reason they're saying that they really love their job now is customers don't shout at them anymore, because the customers know that they're going to turn up on time. Finally, let's have a look at a project system. And again, this is an example of a transactional and project system. So it's really a hybrid. But again, an understanding, knowing where to stick the lever, knowing how to get the change. And when you look at a project or a casework environment, what you see is that the first thing is that the people doing the cases have too many cases open, which leads to these four issues, which is multitasking, in other words, working on too many cases at the one time, which leads to cherry picking, which is doing the easy cases in order to really meet the targets, quality issues, and longer time to process. Second issue is due dates, and because the due dates are being set, so for example in planning you have 56 days to get a determination through, a complete and utter arbitrary number set by the government, what happens is cases get left until the very, very last minute, and then the easy cases get pulled out. So what you see is in effect two systems. The easy cases get done in 56, 57 days or thereabout, and the more difficult cases can go on for 150, 200, 300 days, because once they've failed the service standard, almost what happens is people just leave them and don't bother. So your strategy to get leverage here is one, create a clear priority rule. In other words, first in, first out. Second is a clear list of the cases that need to be worked on, and restricting the number of open cases so that you may only have 5 or 6 cases in the system. Also making sure that the cases have no due dates on them. The job is do it quickly, do it right, and work on the case till the end, and manage throughput. Now, here's an example of a throughput board, and what you can see is the first thing that we've done is we've restricted the number of open cases in the system, As a result, the planners have more time to focus on one case rather than trying to work on a number of cases at any given time. Now, previously in this system, it was taking up to round about 212 days to get a case through the system. What's interesting is that the longest case now is up to 50 days, which is below the government target of 57 days. And most cases actually are going through in about 20 to 30 days. Now, isn't that interesting that the government has set a target of 57 days, which actually caused the cases to run late? Now this council are in a situation whereby actually not focusing on the target, not having the target, cases are being done faster. Isn't that incredible? So if you're in a project environment and you think about it in terms of really the due dates, managing the throughput, restricting the number of open cases, and you track and manage throughput, you can really get an amazing improvement in performance very, very quickly. Also, what will happen is the staff will say to you, just how much they love their job now because they're being able to work on a job to the end. We've just done this in another system very recently in an insurance environment where what they're doing is preparing complex technical documents, and again, cases that would have previously taken 60 to 70 days because of all the multitasking are now going through in 3 or 4 days. So when you're in a casework project type environment, the key is really thinking about this aspect of managing throughput. So there you have it. In order to get the big transformation very, very quickly, the key is really to think about, in a service organisation, these 3 different type of systems. Transactional system, the point of leverage here is doing the job one stop. Process system, the point of leverage here is thinking about the value work and saying, how can we only do the value work and nothing else? And in a project environment, the key is really managing the multitasking, the due dates, and creating a throughput board where you can actually see at any time where a case is blocked, and then someone can go and take action on that case and move it very quickly through the system. If you've found this information useful and you'd like some more help and advice, then go to systemsthinkingmethod.com/Stuart.html, and I'd be happy to do one of 3 things. Either one, have a short conference call with you to give you some help and advice over the phone. Second is you could come to the office and we could meet there and we could have a chat about potentially what help you need to transform your business, or I can come and see you. If you click on the link, you can get further details and you can send an email into the office and someone will call you straight back and schedule a meeting for you and I to talk. In the meantime, I hope that you've enjoyed this information. I hope that I've given you some tips and help that you can go out and use within your own organisation immediately, and that as a result you can really get amazing transformation. Once again, thank you very much. If you do want more help, systemsthinkingmethod.com/Stuart.html. Thank you.